Hello, and welcome to I Am Dad Podcast with your fatherhood authority, Kenneth. 30 minutes of wisdom, information, resources, and nuggets to help you on your fatherhood journey. Or maybe you're just curious and want to hear some real talk about fatherhood, family, and the minds of men. Well, guess what? We got you too. Sit back, grab your pad and pen, and maybe even bring a little something to sip on. Enjoy 30 straight minutes of fatherhood, family, and fun with the Fatherhood Authority, Kenneth Braswell.
Welcome to I Am Dad Podcast. I'm your host, Kenneth Braswell. Thank you so much for joining us on another Sunday morning as we continue to roll along in these conversations and continue to dig into the narratives that I believe are so essential for us to strengthen our families, one father at a time, one community at a time, one neighborhood at a time, one family at a time. And so I am always overwhelmed by my guests who bring such a wealth of content and information, particularly when I get a chance to bring friends that I've been, connected to, not only in friendship, but in this work for such a long time. And so that can tell narratives that I don't have to validate myself. I can say, see, I told you I was with him. Yes, we did this, we did that. And so, but before I do that, I just want to thank each and every last one of you for continuing to heed to my request to make sure that you're following and subscribing, whether you're listening on the podcast platforms, make sure you follow and subscribe. If you're watching the YouTube aspect of what we're doing, just subscribe to the YouTube channel, because those things really help with our algorithms to make sure that we are reaching more people who need to hear these messages. As a result of that, what's driving it. We got the word some weeks ago from FeedSpot, which is a national analyzer of podcasts around the world, over 2 million. They categorize podcasts, and dad podcasts is one of the categories that they look at. There's almost 1,800 podcasts around the world that focus on the conversation of dads, and I Am Dad Podcast ranks at number 7. So I am really, really, really proud of that. And it ranks across several categories. It's not just subscribers and followers. It's content, quality, consistency, social content, a bunch of different categories that they rank them in. But the category that we're not doing the greatest at is subscribers and followers. And so if we can get those numbers up, who knows? We might be able to crack the 5 spot, the 3 spot, maybe even the 1 spot, if we can really elevate this conversation and help us move this conversation not only across the country, but across the world. And so, but my guest today is a longtime friend. He's been a brother with me, not only in this work, but all kinds of work, but specifically as we narrow into this thing we call responsible fatherhood, and more narrowly focus into Black men, Black boys, and our contribution, relevance, and responsibilities to our families. He is none other than Gregory Owens. He is a licensed master social worker and worked for New York State for over 34 years. He's retired now, but he is still toiling in the field doing this work. He's a sought-after keynote speaker, trainer, consultant in leadership development, mentoring, cultural competence, and effective approaches for working with young Black males. He has consulted on racial disproportionality with the N.E. Casey Foundation, who funded the Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative program in the juvenile justice systems in Ohio, Michigan, and Hawaii. We're actually glad to say that we're also working with N.E. Casey Foundation, and I love them. I love how they're pouring into us to continue to elevate this conversation, particularly around our mental health aspect with respect to the Black fathers that we serve. And in March of 2023, he received the Champion for Justice Award from the New York State chapter of the National Association of Social Workers in recognition of his longstanding work to eradicate racial disparities in various systems and to seek justice and fairness for families and communities throughout the United States and abroad. How you doing, sir?
All is well, Ken. It's good to be with you. It's been a moment, so it's a blessing.
Yeah, my good friend would always say to me, When I say how you doing, he says, man, it's better to be seen than to be viewed. That's what he would say to me. And I was like, oh yeah, yes, okay, I could get with that. But what I want to do is I start off all my conversations, Greg, with a simple question, but the response and stories that I received over the last year are just so telling and insightful with respect to why many people do what they do. And I always start off my podcast with tell me your daddy's story. You can tell it from the perspective of your dad, or you can tell it from the perspective of being a dad, or you can tell it from the perspective from both spaces.
So yeah, I've had an opportunity, Ken, to work with you over the course of time and know that this is your entry point for most of these conversations. So you've been consistent with that. So I'm going to try and give a little background about both, because I think both are significant in my life. And I'll start with my daddy's story about my father, who moved up to New York State as my grandmother got him out of Decatur, Alabama. He was very young. Moved up to White Plains, New York, finished high school there, then went back down to Alabama to finish college at Talladega, then went on and became a dentist at a very young age, so young that we ended up having to take him back to Talladega to actually walk with a graduating class about 20 years later, because he left before he could actually walk with the class. He did some of his time in the Air Force over in England, where my brother was born. And so he has always been a guiding light, shining star in our lives, that of my brother and my sister. So we called him home about 1980, but certainly had an impact on us and on many other young men and men as they became adults later on. When his homegoing service was held, people came up to the front of the church and said, Dr. Owens was the father I wish I had, things that I had never heard them say when we were growing up, running track, playing ball. It was just, they were always around, but now I understand they were around partly because of what my father meant to me. And so he made a conscious effort to surround us with strong Black families, strong Black men from different walks of life. And so we had an opportunity to experience some things that many other folks did not experience in terms of understanding. There are and always have been strong Black men in families doing good work, going to church, being servants. I mean, I grew up with that understanding. So I think that laid the groundwork and established the path for me to end up where I am today. And so very much involved in church, running various components of the trustee board and whatnot. That was my father. And also, he's old school. So, if we stepped out of he handled it the old school way. And, that I don't think that did any damage to us, but I know that's not how the world looks upon it today, particularly with our child family system today. But I'm going to tell you something. I think it kept us where we needed to be on the straight and narrow. So between he and my mom being married for 50 years plus, they set a wonderful model for what my brother and my sister and I can explore as we move forward in our lives. And then, of course, Kayla. Kayla's our 27-year-old. She's currently at school in Virginia at George Mason pursuing her doctorate. And she is just the delight of my life. Everything shifted, in terms of quantum effect on me when we had her, right? Everything got clearer and complicated and complex and simple, and just it just became very, very interesting as you watch this child that God allowed you to bring into the world grow and become something and someone that you can really be proud of and say, what, I'm so glad that God allowed me to experience this with this woman. She is very independent. She walks her own path. She lives in Virginia by herself. She has navigated the educational system at American and Georgetown universities there, predominantly white institutions, and yet maintain her focus on who she is as a Black woman. So we're just very, very proud of her. And of course, I was involved in track and field, and when she jumped on the track team when she was real young, that was like the fireworks went off, right? Because I was able to not only be involved in it, but I coached her for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have very fond memories of that as she was growing up, as I know you must have, certainly in Zynga, as we were in track meets together back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
I started to compete. So to me, that's a gift from God that you can never underestimate how good God is. But when you see that kind of manifestation of his glory, you know that this is where you're supposed to be and what you're supposed to just move forward, even without the handbook, right? Even without the plan laid out, you move forward and things can be worked out. So those are my daddy stories to kind of enter our conversation.
Ah, man, that's awesome. You know, I'm listening to you talk about Kayla, and I'm just kind of thinking about Nzinga, and you're right. You know, when she was doing track, that was kind of off my beaten path a little bit, you know, but when she called me after her first year of going to Kennesaw with the idea of becoming a sports medicine doctor, and told me that she didn't think that that was her path and she didn't want to go back to school to do that, and she wanted to be an entrepreneur. I had these mixed emotions because on one hand, she was taking away my story, which was when I get in front of the boys, hey, what's this thing up to? Oh yeah, she's going to Kennesaw. She's going to become a sports doctor. But on the other hand, my baby leaped because she wanted to be an entrepreneur. She wanted to control her own path and do her own thing and follow her own passion. And watching her do that now and watching her become, to your point, the woman that she is, I think the transformational point for her was when I took her to Africa. And she came back. That's actually when that happened. When we came back from Africa, it shifted her mindset, her placement in this world, who she was as a Black woman, and who she was in her responsibility to this race. And so I thank you for always being a mentoring beacon with respect to how fathers specifically should pour into our girls, our boys too, but there's something about those girls, man. When those girls fall off the apple tree and you pick it up and it looks just like you, it's kind of like that's an apple you just hold on to for the rest of your life. And now I'm watching, you know, the same thing with KJ, you know, even though my basketball career was short-lived, you know, this kid has every skill, every attribute, everything that I had when I walked into it. I just didn't follow it through. And now I'm watching him follow it through and looking at him and in an odd way, living vicariously through him, because I'm what would have or could have happened for me if I would have took that route. It just wasn't my route. This was my route, but God is now allowing me to relive it, re-see it, know why he did what he did for me, because he wanted to do what he wanted to do for KJ in his way. And so thank you so much for everything that you've done and all the places that I followed you throughout your career. But the second thing is walking into this space of social work. And so for many people who get into the work that they get into around social work, there's always a driving factor into that, because most people just don't wake up in the morning and say, I want to be a social worker. Something drives them into doing that. What was that thing that drove you into wanting to be a social worker?
I think it was a combination of watching things that my family did. I had the great pleasure of growing up in a household with great grandparents, a grandmother, as well as my parents. And they were all servants, right? They were all servants in one way or another. People would come by and they would just try and help them in any way that they could. I remember one day a young man was being chased by a couple of cats, and he ended up running to our back door to get help. So he knew there was a safe haven in our house. So when you grow up around that, you know, you have kind of an interesting mindset about what it means to develop relationships, interact with people, etc. And then as I kind of worked my way through school, I found that people would often come to me and ask me for insight and advice. And so I found myself kind of talking and walking with people as they kind of met their challenges. This particularly was salient in college. For some reason, when I went to college in New Jersey, found that there were a lot of brothers and sisters there who just needed someone that they could talk to about whatever. And so that began to push me in the direction where I said, well, you know, sociology, psychology, you know, what am I going to do with this here? And then I met a sister who ended up going into the field of social work in front of me and was talking with me about it. And I said, well, let me explore this. And so I got into the school. I ended up finding that was my niche. I ended up doing well after I kind of got it. Because, when you go away to school first, you don't know whether you're supposed to be spending time, socializing or actually studying. So you try and balance it. And it's never balanced initially. This wasn't for me. But when I got the balance and I began to understand that there's all this great stuff you can learn about how to help people better than you thought you could. And then I had the pleasure of being in a school where they focused on institutional racism as well as social work theory and practice. So now lights are going off. And I'm beginning to understand things that have happened in my life that began to make sense because there's a theoretical underpinning to it. And so not only am I better able to help people, I'm better able to understand this racial and racialized dynamic that has people in certain places and spaces where I thought that a helping professional could maybe make some difference. And so that's kind of how I stayed into it. Certainly it wasn't for the money. I never got wealthy, but you don't walk into some things just to get wealthy. And so that's ended up being my passion and where I've been able to do good work. That's kind of my trail that led to going into social.
And then for you and I, we intersected before we actually began to work together in this space through another profession. And I'll come back at that one at the end of the show, because it's just, as you can hear his voice, Pete, you will kind of know where I'm headed with this. And people say the same thing about me. I don't hear it anymore, but people definitely hear it when I begin to talk. They're like, hey, wait a minute, you used to, but we'll get there.
Yeah,
but we get into this.
You still got it.
I still got it. I don't hear it anymore. And so when we get to New York State, our paths began to intersect as I worked for the Office of Temporary Disability Assistance, OTDA, and you work for OCFS. And I walk into the space and walk into this position of being the director of the New York State Fatherhood Initiative. And you're doing a similar work in what I always call the sister agency to OTDA, which I always say that OTDA was tasked with taking care of the adults. OCFS was tasked with taking care of the children. And we needed to figure out how we merge those things. But where we decided in our personal spaces to figure out what that would look like was in this space of fatherhood. And, it's interesting now because coming up is the Million Fathers March that, we operate now within Fathers Incorporated as a result of going to see, its founder, who is gone from us now, but in heaven, rest in peace, Philip Jackson. After him and myself and Sean Dove and David Miller went to Chicago after he had gotten out of the hospital to see him and check up on him. And we were hanging out with him during that day. And he turned to me, he's like, Kenny, I really want you to take over the Million Fathers March. He says, you understand it better than anybody else has. And I don't want this thing to die. I know you can keep it alive. And so that's what I've been trying to do since that day. And so, but right now, we were on a nice little trek and then COVID hit, bam, shut everything down. And then now post-COVID, we're just now ramping that thing back up this year, and school hasn't even started yet. And we already are in 102 cities across the country in 30 states. It is moving like crazy right now. But I go back to the conversations you and I were having when we were trying to convince both OTDA and OCFS that getting involved in the Million Fathers March was something that we needed to do. And the first task that we were both hit with was, we could do this. We love the concept, but we have to change the name. Talk to me about what you remember about how we had to kind of shift around the kind of broader concept of working with fathers, and more specifically with Black fathers, but trying to do that within governmental agencies that had their own perspective about what things should look like.
Yeah, that brings back a lot of interesting memories. And I was preparing for this by listening to some of your earlier podcasts, and you continue to be consistent in telling people you can work with children and families, but if you're not working with fathers, you're really not working with the entire family. And so I think that was what we were trying to get these institutions, these state agencies Very few of which were run by people who really understood the significance of involving fathers in a real important way. That dads count, and that the work that we're doing has to include fathers, whatever you think about them and feel about them, because that changes the outcome and has an impact on what happens to children and families down the road. And people were not really ready to hear that, particularly from two Black men, right? So there was that component to it also. And so what you're doing is, of course, pushing against the institutional pushback against anything that A, is new, B, seems to be outside of their normal walk in terms of, let's get funding, let's do the project, let's do the checklist and make sure that we met our objectives. This was very different than that. We're talking about engagement. We're talking about relationships. We're talking about things that really are required to do effective fatherhood work. And they really weren't ready to hear it. And the other side of that, I think, was the racialized component to it, because the reason that we had to switch the name, as you remember, because they didn't want to be affiliated, New York State government at the time, didn't really want to be affiliated with this thing called the Black Star Project. And all that really was about, right? And that the focus was on Black fathers, and they were very uncomfortable with that. And so we changed it to Dad, Take Your Child to School, as a way to kind of meet whatever reticence and resistance we met within our state agencies. But I can tell you, and you experienced it at OTDA, in OCFS, there was a constant struggle to keep it on the agenda, to make sure people understood what it was all about. Very little support in the first couple of Dads Take Your Child to School Day events. But then later on, all of a sudden, people want to get on television and act like they have been supporting it, right? All of a sudden, people want to talk about it. And quite honestly, very recently, I was asked to go back to OCFS to moderate a panel on fatherhood. And I said, nah, first of all, OCFS is in my rearview mirror right now. I've got another direction that I'm going into. Secondly, by this time, if you have not integrated it into the ongoing policy practice and other considerations of the agency, you're still not serious about it. If you got to call me to come in and moderate a panel, I could get all, ego-driven by it. But I think what really happens is people don't embed it in the organizational philosophy, and they try and find ways to make it look like it's working, when in point of fact, it's really not embedded in the institutional mindset of the agency. So I appreciate the fact that you are continuing to do the work, that the Fathers Incorporated entity has picked it up from Phil. I think you are the perfect entity to continue to move this forward and to have it grow. Just as we were doing here in New York, you're doing around the country and internationally. So I think that we will continue, if people like you and others who are in the space continue to talk about the significance of fathers, dispel the negative mythology, and dispel the negative data, which isn't true anyway.
Absolutely. And, the other thing, too, is, there's another space that you and I walked into as well. And we received many revelations of trying to move this work, into the juvenile facilities and really looking at what fatherhood looked like there. And I remember you and I going down to some of those facilities and having conversations with them about that. And, one of the things that strikes me the most when I think about that time is that they could not even fathom the fact that in juvenile facilities, they had boys who were fathers, right? That no one tracked them, that no one knew that there were dads in juvenile facilities that had kids. And I remember Monique Rapidu, we were sitting down one day and I said, we should do a scan if we can, individuals that are in OCF's juvenile facilities and see where child support is hitting. And the list came back, it was ridiculous, the number of young, particularly Black boys who were fathers that were building arrears in child support and had no idea that those things were being built. But the difficulty in going into those facilities, as you said, and to convince them that this work was relevant work for boys, to strengthen them to be better fathers, but to strengthen our communities, and that was relevant work that they should be looking at, was so hard to get people to understand. And I still, to this day, I get it now. But back then, it was like, my goodness, how much do we have to do and climb over in order to get people to see us. When you think about that time and you think about now, and I want to go back, I'm gonna be bouncing back and forth only because I just walk these narratives through. When you look at what you're seeing today out there, when it looks at relevancy, essentialness, and value of particularly Black fathers in this space, how much have we changed from 20 years ago to today?
Well, I think there's at least two perspectives I have on that. One is that I think there's been some change because people are seeing Black men in particular and other men of color, but particularly Black and brown men, a little differently, right? That there has been some success, certainly in spaces and places where we may not have seen Black men be successful. That now people see it and can say, yeah, maybe there is a way to engage with these folks that we felt were not really value added, right? At the same time, we still have negative imagery, stereotypes promulgated by media and promulgated by public narrative about Black men, well, in many ways, Black men in particular, that continues to perpetuate this notion of whether or not, the question of whether or not we really do add value. And so in some ways, yeah, there's been some progress. And in other ways, we're still stuck in those old narratives, particularly in a child family system, particularly where you have a juvenile justice system therein, where people are saying, in different places around the country, they don't deserve anything. They should be locked up 23 hours a day in solitary. In Louisiana, the populace voted against building a new facility, which I'm okay with. We don't need more facilities, but they were going to build one, and they were going to have air conditioning in it for most of the young men who were in the facility. And they voted against it because they didn't think these young men and particularly young Black men deserved air conditioning in Louisiana. In the youth justice system. So in many ways, I think that we have shifted a bit, but certainly not the way that we would have wanted to, given all the hard work.
There's a lot of stuff that's happened since you and I have departed both of those agencies, and things that we have had to kind of incorporate and deal with within our work. One of the issues and one of the things is race, but within this conversation of race, we have kind of watched the stories of people like Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, and the names go on and on and on and on and on. And some sisters are in there as well. Yeah. When we look at this work today, and one of the stories that I always mention to people, Greg, is this kind of mental health component as it relates to grief. And the grieving process over our fallen men. And I know that you are now getting into the space of healing, right? And so you got this grief thing happening on one side and the necessity of healing on the other side. But people don't have time to heal because they keep having to constantly grieve over what's going on. How much of your work now that you're beginning to move in this space around healing is going to help us impact what's happening with at least the mentality, well-being, and mindfulness and mindset, of our families?
So I have had the pleasure of being certified by Flourish Agenda, Dr. Sean Gin Wright's program, which has healing-centered engagement as one of the ways of dealing with the trauma that is persistent for many of our people, right? And so it's a bit different than trauma-informed care, because that really speaks to episodic kinds of trauma that can be dealt with maybe clinically, but doesn't get to the root causes. So when I now incorporate this notion of healing-centered engagement, it acknowledges the fact that the grieving process and the trauma is not episodic. It doesn't have an endpoint. It is ongoing, like revving your car 24 hours a day. So things are going to break. That's where harm comes in. And so what we need to do is implement a different worldview about what healing looks like. And that grieving may be an ongoing proposition. On the other side of that is this notion of what does well-being look like? And realizing that, young people will tell us, I'm more than my trauma. I'm more than what happened to me. So the question we have to ask them is, who do you want to be? Not what happened to you, and certainly not what did you do, but who is it that you want to be? And so Dr. Ginwright's program offers us a framework for that gets us not just to trauma and to trying to cope with trauma, to get beyond it and get to what it means to be a whole, fully human person in this world that has agency, that has aspirations, that understands that relationships are important, that walks through these toxins that exist in the world and can still manage to get to a healthy or well-being set of circumstances. So that's why I think healing-centered engagement is so central to everything that we need to do, and why I'm making it a part of my organization's transformation work to deal with racial justice in lots of instances.
Yeah, it's so critical because literally just yesterday I was having a conversation with someone and I posed this to them and I'll pose it to you and you tell me what you think about this. And we were talking about this incident in Montgomery, Alabama. Mm-hmm. And my comment was, and I'll tell you who I was talking about because he wasn't mine. I was talking to Bishop Ferguson about it. Mm-hmm. And him and I shared the same kind of thought. And I said, I'm numb about it. I said, I'm not rejoicing because of some notion of we finally got them. I'm not horrified by what I saw because to a certain extent, I'm a little desensitized to stuff like that. I said, part of my issue now is the response that I'm seeing and how people are responding to the incident using a false face of humor, right? Using humor to get past it. And my thought was that in and of itself is the problem that we should be looking at because we're not absorbing this in the way that we should absorb it because we can't absorb it anymore. And this is what I said to him. And I said that what it looks like to me, and I've been thinking about this a lot, and I don't know what to do with it. I've just been thinking about it. It is that when we think about our behavior and our response to what's happening to us as a people, it has always been the solution, at least what we think is the solution, is that we have to change our culture, that we have to change the culture of who we are and change how we function and change our responsive culture. And I said to him yesterday, and I said, and this is kind of gleaming a little bit from what I had revelation about when I came from Kenya this year. And I said, it almost feels like this is no longer a culture issue. This is a DNA issue. And when you said that that this grief and what we're going through has been sustained, there is an evolutionary change to DNA that becomes part of who you are to adapt. It's almost like short-necked giraffes who grew long necks in order to get to the rubberage that was higher up. It almost feels like today that our responsiveness to these kinds of things, particularly racism, has now become part of our DNA, which makes it much more difficult to impact and change than it is to change culture. And I don't know if that makes sense. It makes sense in my head. Now, what do I do with that? And how do I impact it? And how do I get past that? I have absolutely no idea, but it is at least how I'm seeing it.
So, yeah, I think that there are a couple of things that are really important from what you just said. There's climate change and culture change. I have always been a proponent of changing climate because culture is so hard to change. Culture is the history and the backdrop and what happened that caused us to be where we are. So people who want to be culture change specialists have to deal with all of that. And most people think, well, I come in here and I'm going to change the culture. You have a better opportunity to change the climate by changing language, by changing relationships, by changing how we feel about one another. And that can lead to a different reality than you do about changing all the things that happened that caused it to be this way. So the relevance to Montgomery for me is, yes, we did use humor to get through it because we're suffering so much. In this day and time, we are being harmed by public policy, by narratives, by people who really would rather see us somewhere else in lots of ways and shapes. And so we are feeling as if we're under attack, and it feels like I've got one chance to get back. And so now the memes come out and all the humor comes out. To me, that's a result of people who are really very harmed by their circumstance. So I think the way to get to the other side of this, Ken, is to begin to shift the worldview. We have, as one person listened to recently said, we have accepted the abnormal as normal. And we have walked in that path for so long that we no longer realize that was abnormal. That whole interaction, from the time that brother got up there to try and get them to move that pontoon or whatever it was, to the resulting, explosion of violence against him, the response that came back as a result of that, none of that should have happened in the fashion that it did. It was an abnormal circumstance. And yet we live in a society where that kind of reaction and that kind of response looks like it's almost normal. And so let's deal with it like it's a normal thing. And now we'll apply humor to it and blah, 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 blah. So we have to first accept, I think all of that is abnormal. Secondly, it harms us. It harms all of us. It is particularly harmful in terms of racial aspects for Black people. And then we need to shift the worldview to what would it look like if we didn't have to deal with all of that. That's the possibility of thinking. We get hung up in solving problems and not looking at possibilities. There is a reality of a possibility where that never happens again. And I think we need to focus on that.
Now, when you look at our youth, because, you are focused like I am in a very different way, specifically on Black boys and what that looks like, I literally, I need for you to send me your mailing address. I literally just released a book, an affirmation journal for Black dads, because I'm in this space that, Black men specifically, but more particularly Black dads need to be affirmed, right? They need to know that they're worthy. I use this as a narrative all the time when I'm speaking about this. And I always say that, there's a reason that Spider-Man is called amazing, because there's some mornings that he wakes up and he doesn't feel so amazing. And someone has to remind him that he's amazing. The same thing with the Hulk. There are mornings that he wakes up as strong as he is. He doesn't feel so incredible. And he has to be reminded that he's incredible. So no matter how great you are in whatever it is you do, affirmation is critical to maintaining who you are, because of the things that you have to battle each and every day for the reasons that you battle it. And so my thought was I wanted to create an affirmation journal to really kind of help dads, Black dads in particular, speak life into themselves so that they can get up each morning, and if no one else reminds them, give them the power to remind themselves that they're worthy, that they're essential, that they're needed, that they're loved, that they're all those things. And after I finished that, God just works the way he works to me. He was like, okay, now we need to do it for middle school Black boys, and you also need to do it for middle school Black girls. And so those two will be out in June. So I'm moving in this space of affirmation. So I really want to connect with you on this healing thing, in this healing space, because I really believe affirmation is part of that healing process. That's one of the things that when you talk about changing the climate, you change the climate by what rolls off of your tongue in the morning, particularly when you're speaking to yourself. And that have to reimagine a language that we speak that affirms who we are, even within the situation that we're in, so that we don't succumb to the constant bombardment of traumatic episodes and traumatic consistency that we have had to deal with, over the course of time. Because at the end of that line is our children's children's children. And at some point, we got to start thinking about how what we're being traumatized today is going, and how we respond to that trauma today is going to impact our great grandchildren moving forward. So when you're thinking about that, if you're thinking that long range in the work that you're doing, how are you thinking about incorporating what we have to do as particularly Black men for our youth?
So I'm going to take a page from Dr. Ginwright's healing work and talk about this notion of transactional relationships versus transformative relationships. So most of our relationships, if we're not careful, become transactional, a business model, and one that's based upon, the capitalist business model that we have been convinced is the best way to live in this culture, right? I'm not going to give you something unless I can get something back. And by the way, I expect to get more back just because is our way of relating to one. I'm not going to help you unless I can get something back. That's transactional. It's also transactional to have a checklist every day instead of realizing that relationship building and capacity building is more transformative than this checklist. So the to-do list doesn't become your end all. But asking the question every morning, who do I need to be today, becomes the way that you engage in the day, right? Because we know life and death comes out of the power of the tongue, right? That's what our faith walk tells us. And so, Dr. Ginwright also says that we need to start with our mirror and not our lens. What does that mean? We need to talk to ourselves in the morning, like you're saying, and do these affirmations while we talk to God, who is also going to tell us, you're made in my image and my likeness, so there ain't nothing like you. So if you don't believe that, God is in control of your life, at least understand these affirmations from a more cultural perspective, that if you continue to repeat something, eventually it will become part of your narrative because it becomes part of what you say on a more regular basis. So I completely agree. Affirmations are part of a healing process. You got to do them regularly and religiously, if you will, and you got to practice them. It's not just practice that makes perfection. It's perfect practice. So you can't miss doing an affirmation in the morning and then maybe several times during the course of the day. So I like the fact that you're going to kind of break it down and have it by age group and by gender. Those are important considerations because, as you said, Black men and young Black men are going through different kinds of things depending on where they are in their age group. And then there's our sisters who are going through some things that they really need to take a look at affirmations to improve circumstance. We got intergenerational things to think about. We can't think about today anymore. We got to think about what we want it to be like for our children's children's children. So how do you do that? You speak truth into it.
Right. So when you look at the professional landscape, as we kind of round out to a close, there has been an emergence of this term DEI, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when I first heard it, and now that I know more about it, now that I've read more about it, now that I've seen more about it, now that I've seen it activated in very, to my bird's eye, dysfunctional ways that people, corporations, and companies are trying to press DEI. One of the things that I've said is DEI is just affirmative action and diversity by another name. It's a thin veil of the right terminology to use to hold back the resistance to the current situation of oppression within the corporate and upper control structure, right? And so, but while that is happening on one level, we have still got to take the content of that very serious, because it is important, that there is equity. It is important that there is inclusion. It is important that there is diversity, but it always seems that those things come at the expense of us. Right. And so as you're framing DEI within the work that you are now doing and have always done in this space, what does it look like now, and how should it be looking as we move forward?
Yeah, thanks for that, because I am not a huge proponent of DEI as an end all, just like I'm not a huge proponent of cultural competence as an end all. It doesn't stop with being culturally competent. You have to understand the fullest nature of culture and how it impacts us. DEI becomes a catchphrase if you don't have fairness and justice as your ultimate destination. So D is diversity, that's just difference, right? Equity is achieved only when everybody has an opportunity to experience opportunities in the same fashion, and we know that's not happening. right? Inclusivity is good because you can feel like you belong at the table. But I like John Powell's work on belonging, because that leads us further down the road towards fairness and justice and bigger transformative ideas. So if you just want to, focus on DEI, then you begin counting numbers, and it does become an affirmative action exercise if you're not careful. Because people never peel back who really has the power and who has always had the power and who they're passing on the power to, and where the opportunities really present themselves for my grandchildren the same way they present themselves for your grandchildren. And that's why this legacy conversation, as they try and undo affirmative action, is really getting kind of interesting, isn't it? Because now you're talking about fairness and justice and not just numbers, right? And so I think that DEI is not an end all, that it really doesn't have the same relevance as looking at what fairness and justice, real true belonging is.
There's a real extremely erratic behavior that has been happening for a minute now, but it just kind of reared its head the other day as Alpha Phi Alpha pulled their conference out of Florida, right?
Right.
So there is, to your point, there is a climate and an environment that is building that is clearly speaking to Black people who live in Florida, that this is not the space that we want you here.
Right.
We really want to eliminate your history, and we want to eliminate your history so that it eliminates you and moves you out. And so one of the most revered fraternities in our country says, okay, we're out then.
Right.
We out. We're going to go somewhere else.
Yep.
But the response to them doing exactly what you're forcing them to do is then met by death threats.
Yes.
It's like, okay, wait a minute. Yep. It's like a dysfunctional relationship. It's like, do you want me to go, or is it that you want to just suppress me and allow me to stay here so that you can continue to abuse me? What does that really look like? Like that behavior, do you see that increasing, or do you see that just being a sign of the times?
No, I think it's going to increase, because once the genie's out the bottle, you can't get the genie back in the bottle. And in the last administration, and historically, quite honestly, but it was so very much in our faces in the last administration, it's real clear that white supremacy is first and foremost on the table for certain segments who are in power in this country. They don't have any problem with being straight up about not wanting Black folks, not only their history, but their presence, right? Not only our history, but the reality of the things that we've done to make America what America is, our history in the world, And so you're right, if you can eliminate my history, you eliminate me, but you eliminate me into the future. So if I'm not careful, my grandchildren don't even understand and have no place in this. And so I think that this is very dangerous. And I also want to put a pin in this notion of us being asked to be resilient. We don't need to just focus on being resilient. We need to move through resilience, which in many people who are in this space that you and I work in understand that resilience can sometimes be seen as asking us to suffer with nobility, right? And so, I don't really want your presence and your history in Florida, but come on in and bring your millions of dollars, and pump them into my state, right? And so when you say, well, I'm not going to do that, well, now I'm angry at you, because in my power, I should be able to force you to do that. And so we've got all this going on that I think is just going to manifest itself more until we make that turn and get back to some sense of what is normal. All this is abnormal behavior from abnormally behaving people. And so until we call that out and say, you know what, not only is this abnormal, but it's harming the entire environment. This entire country is suffering as a result of it. And our place within the world is suffering. And by the way, your children will be suffering too. I think this thing goes down a very bad path. Wow.
Man, Brother Greg, thank you. You always fill my soul with it. I done walked away with a whole bunch of things I got to now think about, but we'll be talking, because I think there's some spaces that I want to bring your voice into. There's some spaces that there's some things that I want to do, and some ideas that I have about some things in these spaces that I think would be incredible for us to be able to start moving around the country. The last thing I wanted to just kind of bring up was something I talked about earlier, and that was one of the intersections of our relationship going back now 20 years, and that is radio. Like, right, we both were radio personalities. We love radio. Yeah. We worked for the same radio station. We did our thing. Do you ever miss it?
Oh my gosh, yeah. Someone just asked me that the other day. And I told them I would still be doing it if they still had a musical genre that I could really manifest my talents, right? And so, they asked me for a second if I wanted to do something in country western, and the station flipped over here. And I said, I'm not a country western DJ. I don't do that stuff, right? And I really, at that point, had kind of moved beyond the hip hop stuff because I was kind of aged out of that in terms of, what my voice would have sounded like on the air. But I got to tell you, those 9 years was a wonderful experience. I met some incredible artists, learned a lot about the music and the industry. And so the short version is, yes, I do miss it.
Yeah, I had a chance. I was at an event in DC this past summer and was on this platform to, talk about fatherhood and a couple of other things at the Department of Education. And I told Dr. Q English, which is someone I need to connect you with, powerful sister. Oh my goodness, she is powerful. But anyway, she put this event together. I never paid attention to the flyer. She sent me the flyer. I got the flyer. I was like, all right, yeah, I'll regurgitate it. I'll put it out there. I never read the flyer. And someone DM'd me and said, yo, that's dope. Like, you on a panel with Kim. And I was like, Kim who? It's like, Kim, like K-E-M. I was like, what panel you talking about? Wow. It's like, I'm like, what panel you talking about? They was like, the thing you just posted. And I went and looked at it, and there he is, like K-E-M, along with A.R. Bernard, Otis, all these, these like the power people. Yeah. I never looked at it, paid it any attention. So now I'm in the room with him, and I'm looking, I'm like, dude, you don't even understand how much your music brought me through sometimes I needed to get through, and how, I met you before you became who you were in a hallway in Washington, D.C. at a YMCA conference when he was selling CDs out of his trunk, and we had a conversation about that. He was like, oh my God, I forgot about that. And we're talking, and I was like, and here you are in front of me. And I said to him, and my wife had just taken me to a concert to see him in Atlanta. And so here he is in the room, and he is telling his story about his challenge with depression and being a dad. And it all came full circle for me. It was kind of like, whoa. Like, you look at these individuals a certain way because you sat there behind this mic and you played their music, you sing their songs, and you resonate with what they're saying. But one of the things that I never paid enough attention to, that you listen to the lyrics of the hit songs, but you don't listen to the lyrics of those songs that they put their 10 toes into. Yeah. And so when he tells a story and he attaches it to a song, then I go back and listen to the song. I'm like, oh my God, I missed that. I missed that. In the mix of him being who he was, this cat was struggling.
Yeah. And you don't have the filter for that if you don't know his story, right?
Absolutely. And so the way I miss it is if I knew what I knew then, what I knew today. And that was being able, that would be finding a way to use those influential voices to empower the community in a way that levels the humanity of who they are, separate from the stardom of who they sell for records, but to allow community to know the real stories about the individuals that they're listening to, and don't find out about their struggle until their biopic is made and placed on. That's what I miss about it. I miss and wish I could do that now, as I listen to lyrics very differently now. I'm listening to these young brothers pour out and tell their stories about what they're dealing with out there. And we're not paying attention to it because we've dismissed the genre, right? Because it's not what it used to be. That's what we say. It's not. No music has ever been what it used to be.
It's all moving and growing into the future. Yep.
Yeah. And so that's when I miss it. And I missed it. And then the other place I miss it is when I go to a party and the DJ is whack and I'm sitting there like.
Right. Don't you know? That's funny.
Greg, thank you so much, man. I'll be calling on you. You'll be hearing from me. Make sure you send me, I'll send you a text so I can get your address so I can send you this book that I just finished.
I look forward to getting it. Keep doing God's work, brother. We'll be in touch, all right?
Absolutely. Thank you, and take care.
You too now.
Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us. You've been listening to I Am Dad Podcast. We hope that you have been informed, encouraged you to think, or even inspired your heart for the love of dads. The conversation does not end here. Come back and join us next week. Same time, same place. Or you can continue the dialogue on our I Am Dad Facebook page. We also invite you to listen to past episodes, learn more about us, and keep up with special activities by visiting IamDadPodcast.com. That's IamDadPodcast.com. Until next time, I leave you with this reminder of manhood from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 11. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. Because of this reminder, I will always understand that I am dad, period.